Greetings, dear friends. My name is Vasyl Pekhnio. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I invite all of you to watch this latest update on Ukrainian battle map situation as of October the 13th. So that will be summing up of the results on the battlefield of this weekend. So please join, watch this video, like it, share it, subscribe, and leave your comments just below the video. Let's start. Let's start with the Zaporizhzhia front, where just last week the chief of the general staff of the Russian army, General Gerasimov, stated that it is precisely the Zaporizhzhia region, specifically the Zaporizhzhia direction, with the settlements of Stepnohirsk and Primorske, that are becoming the #1 points in terms of the Russian army's influence on the further course of hostilities. Reporting to Putin, he stated that Primorske and Stepnohirsk, I remind you where these settlements are located, right here on the Zaporizhzhia direction, are becoming the #1 targets for the occupiers. And interestingly, literally right after Gerasimov's statement, our armed forces responded not with words but with actions, because Gerasimov was, in all likelihood, just talking. Why do I say that he was most likely just talking? Because in my Saturday review, I made the assumption that this could be an information attack aimed at distracting our attention from the main area of combat activity on the enemy's side. And that area is precisely the Donetsk region, the Pokrovsk direction. Because if we look at the reports generated daily by the general staff, we will see that consistently the largest number of combat engagements occurs precisely in the Pokrovsk direction. In addition, the enemy has been reinforcing the Pokrovsk direction lately by deploying its reserves. Moreover, it is in the Pokrovsk direction that the enemy is advancing with mechanized columns. Well, in other words, Zaporizhzhia is a very fragmented area made up of a patchwork of units, both on our side and theirs. By the way, over the weekend, some soldiers reached out to me and said that in our case, on the Ukrainian side, things are actually quite... Well, you could say that at one time the transition to the core system actually played a negative role in the defense of the Zaporizhzhia direction, particularly in the preparation of defenses in the Stepnohirsk area near the settlement of Kupiansk. Why? Because each newly formed corps receives its own headquarters, and officers are sent to these headquarters from among the battalion and brigade commanders, as well as staff officers from those same battalions or brigades. And at a certain point, when officers were sent to the corps headquarters, a very serious vacuum of leadership personnel arose in our units that were engaged here on the front lines. This personnel vacuum led to a certain vacuum in actions, which, as a result, meant that the units were not fully combat ready, or let's say, not as capable as they should have been. I suspect and understand that this, in particular, resulted in the eventual dismissal, one of the first dismissals of the 20th Army Corps. Here, on this Zaporizhzhia direction, even now we do not observe what the Russians are claiming, that they are going to try to break through at this point, which they consider to be a weak spot in the defense of our troops. I'll go back to the fact that actually over the weekend, our soldiers delivered at least an informational slap in the face by announcing, and not just our soldiers, but the general staff itself, that we managed to liberate the settlement of Malyi Shcherbaky. Yesterday evening, the general staff released a video. Such a video isn't demonstrative, it doesn't prove anything after all, like how some positions of the occupiers are being hit in the area of Malyi Shcherbaky. But most importantly, it's the recording, the address that was jointly recorded by the fighters of the 24th Separate Assault Battalion Aidar and the 33rd Assault Regiment, who announced precisely the liberation of this settlement called Malyi Shcherbaky. Malyi Shcherbaky is part of the Stepnohirsk community, meaning Malyi Shcherbaky is directly affiliated with Stepnohirsk, so it's not surprising that they are interconnected in such defensive formation. So let's listen to the fighters. It should be noted that as a result of a joint operation by the fighters of the 33rd Separate Assault Regiment and the 24th Separate Assault Battalion Aidar, the settlement of Malyi Shcherbaky is under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. So what does this mean? Well, honestly, I'll say this. It's not that it's not quite true, but right now it's very difficult to measure control, such ironclad control over certain settlements, especially those located on the line of contact. That is, right now it's difficult to say definitively that, for example, Stepnohirsk is under our control, or Malyi Shcherbaky is guaranteed to be under our control, or for instance, Kupiansk is under the enemy's control, or say Stepov. To say that it is 100% under the enemy's control would not be entirely accurate, because the line of contact is very blurred. And this blurring of the line of contact, control over settlements or certain areas within this gray zone or the ring zone that is formed, is a very, very relative concept. because overall, as I said, the entire front is a gray strip. Both our positions and the enemies are in it, and they are interwoven like this. This is how the control of drones is interwoven. We fly deep into the enemy's rear, and they fly deep into ours. And so the shifting of positions, even this issue is quite rapid, meaning today we control and declare Malyi Shcherbaky ours. Tomorrow, it could be the enemy who raises their flag there, and in reality, this greatly distorts the actual picture of the situation, both in the headquarters for the information community and for us as observers. Back in 2022, it was clear. If there was a flag, it meant the settlement was liberated. Now, you can't say that with 100% certainty. That's why, in the case of Malyi Shcherbaky, as far as I know, Deep State is deliberately not coloring this area green as liberated until they fully understand the situation. You could say that here, for sure, we managed to deliver an informational slap to the Russians, who had just declared this direction as the main axis of their offensive in the Zaporizhzhia region, and immediately received, to use boxing terminology, a punch in response. Of course, this does not diminish the achievements of our fighters and the 33rd Assault Battalion, the Assault Regiment, and the 24th Assault Battalion of the Aidar fighters as well. I'm just saying that right now the concept of control over a settlement is very relative. Some of our fighters whom I talk to say that it's not accurate to speak of total control by our troops over Skripnohirsk, because Russian infantry and assault troops are constantly infiltrating there, and enemy drones are always flying in. And that's why the concept of control is extremely relative right now. That's why honestly, I would urge people not to hype up any big victories in terms of us having some major successes in the Zaporizhzhia region. Although, as I said, this is actually a pretty good informational punch in response to Russian propaganda, which is ramping up talk of an offensive in this area. Meanwhile, the main fighting is taking place in the Pokrovsk direction, or more precisely, the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya direction, as I would describe it to the Kremlin. Yesterday, late in the evening, there were some interesting changes on the Deep State map that showed us many areas of liberated settlements. In particular, new blue zones appeared in the area of the settlement of Vilna near Novi Shakovy and Ivanivka. Meanwhile, according to Deep State's assessment, the Russians advanced in Kucherevyi Yar. This, in fact, demonstrates the hybrid nature of the gray zone. It would seem that Kucherev Yar is an area that has been completely surrounded by our forces for a long time, yet supplies are still being delivered there, drones and ground robotic systems are still operating, and the enemy garrison is able to remain there, maintain its defense, and even expand its zones of control and influence, as we can see on the Deep State map in Kucherevyi Yar. Deep State also noted advances toward Volodymyrivka and Shakov. In this area, specifically in the second circle that I outlined on the map, mechanized assaults were carried out over the past week, and it was precisely there that the enemy directed a large number of airborne troops, who, according to statements from our soldiers, were destroyed. I still expect that this week the enemy's mechanized activity will resume. Let me emphasize once again the main logic behind such mechanized assaults. Note that during the summer and early autumn, the Russians hardly lost any of their equipment, and in fact, they didn't use it. This was because there was green cover, plantations, bushes, trees, which allowed them to hide from our Ukrainian drones. Now, as autumn begins and the weather turns bad, a whole set of circumstances is coming together that compels the Russians to use their equipment. The first of these factors is the need to somehow cover their infantry, which has to advance because now there are no more plantations. Well, at least they're disappearing, let's put it that way, because if you look out the window, you can still see green, yellow, and red colors. The forests are colored in these shades, but gradually all of this will disappear, the leaves will fall, and the battlefield will become completely transparent for Ukrainian and ultimately Russian drones as well. Therefore, in order to continue the offensives, in order for the infantry to keep advancing, they somehow need to be transported to the front line, and that will be done by vehicles. That's why we will now see the enemy using vehicles more frequently. This is the first factor that influences this. The second factor is the worsening weather. Because, well, the hypothesis is the worse the weather, the worse the drones fly. They lose connection more often, sometimes they can't take off at all, and the transmitter signals can be weaker. EUTers for drones, so the more reliable the drone systems are, which now, I don't know, probably account for 4/5, maybe even 5/6 of all strikes at the front, the less they will be able to be used in bad weather. That's why the Russians will be bringing out their equipment from storage, which they had relatively preserved during the summer and early autumn campaigns, and I think they will use it specifically in this Pokrovsk direction. By the way, Konstantin Mashovets, an analyst from the Information Resistance Group, claims that here, in the Dobropilya direction, the enemy has committed an additional portion of its reserves to battle, including assets and forces concentrated in the area of the 8th Combined Arms Army. On the left flank of this breakthrough, that is, in the area where our blue sections and the enemy's red sections meet, specifically in the areas between Volodymyrivka and Poltavka, this is where the enemy is now deploying its reinforcements on the left flank of our defense, as well as in the area of Novotoretske and Volodymyrivka. According to Konstantin Mashevets, fresh enemy reserves are now appearing here. At the same time, the assertion that Pokrovsk remains the #1 target for the enemy and not Zaporizhzhia is supported by the fact that the Russians have recently advanced south of Pokrovsk in the area of Udakhne and Kotlyne. In particular, in the area of Udakhne, the Pokrovske mine, specifically mine management #1, was captured, or okay, if not fully captured, then at least the enemy was clearly present there. I pointed this out just last week, showing that this is quite a substantial and large enterprise. We can even look at the map right now to see what it all looks like. On the deep state satellite map just north of Udakhne, you can see quite a massive enterprise right here. Our fighters were working on it, and footage of these operations appeared throughout last week. And unfortunately, if the enemy is here, it's a bad sign, because it gives them the opportunity to gain a foothold in serious industrial facilities, counting on the fact that these industrial sites will further help the enemy advance. And here, as you can see from this area, there aren't that many obstacles left. The main goal of the enemy from here is to move toward Hrashin, cutting off the routes both from Pokrovsk to Pavlohrad, this road, as well as through the settlement of Hrashin, which is currently our alternative for moving our troops and for our logistics in the Pokrovsk direction. So to the south of Pokrovsk, the situation here is frankly not the best. Besides this, in the south of Pokrovsk itself, the occupiers are constantly entering a kind of gray zone that they have created in the area of One Travnia and the park in the southeast of Pokrovsk, where they keep trying to enter and occupy the apartment building. They need the apartment buildings here in order to establish a higher, let's say, radio horizon and to use their drones. Accordingly, the higher the radio horizon, the farther the drone can fly, the fewer obstacles it encounters, and the more of our logistics it can strike in our rear. That's why south of Pokrovsk, the situation is not as great as one might say, that everything is under perfect control here. This is exactly why there is such a concentration of combat forces in the Dobropilya area. The partial successes of the enemy south of Pokrovsk also lead us to think that Pokrovsk remains the #1 target and by no means Zaporizhzhia. That's why it suggests that the area of Stepnohirsk, which Gerasimov mentions, could be an attempt at an informational distraction. Very often questions appear in the comments. So, what's happening in Kupiansk? Let's briefly touch on what's going on there as well. In Kupiansk, just as the Russians entered the settlement, they continue to remain there. Let's take a look at the administrative boundaries of the city of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region as a whole. Here you can see that the only areas under enemy control, or the only areas where they are relatively present, are the northern and northwestern outskirts. In fact, these areas, the city itself, and to the northwest, by the way, in the areas of Radkivka, Kinrashivka, and Holubivka, it can be said that the enemy has managed to gain a foothold here. Everything south of this square is nothing more than areas of very situational, occasional infiltration. This infiltration is actually carried out by very small infantry groups that our troops manage to isolate. What is happening in the north, here in this red square, is that the Russian occupiers appear much more frequently here. They are, in fact, present in the areas south of the settlement of Tishchankivka, in the areas of Kindrashivka, in the area of Radkivka, Mirna, formerly known as Moskovka, Holubivka, and also in the very north and the far west of the city of Kupiansk itself, where they are concentrating. By the way, the enemy has also been observed on the outskirts of Sobolivka. From here, they are trying to get into the city. So what is the situation?
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Overall, it is not very favorable for the armed forces of Ukraine, because from the very first day the Russians entered Kupiansk, it was clear that it would be very difficult to drive the enemy out of there. Why? Because we lack infantry. We lack infantry who can physically, on foot, drive the enemy out of the ruins of buildings. It is possible to do this with drones, but it is extremely difficult. Our soldiers are doing it, but just imagine what it's like when there are ruins, because, you know, sometimes there are still some pipes sticking out. How can you use a drone? How will you track down that Russian who suddenly ends up in your rear if you haven't spotted him? That's why we need infantry groups here. We need to go on foot from house to house and eliminate the enemy. We don't have these capabilities. The enemy knows this. The enemy understands this. And that's exactly why they're putting such an emphasis on Kupiansk, by maintaining the continuity of their attacks on our exhausted units, the ones holding the defense here, which are few in terms of infantry numbers. The enemy attacks relentlessly. That's their main tactic here right now. Relentlessness, like water that wears away stone. They want to break through this stone, not by smashing it, but by simply washing it away. That's what they're trying to do in Kupiansk. For now, we're managing to block the Russians on the northern, I repeat, northwestern outskirts, but the situation is actually quite difficult and not entirely favorable for our troops, especially considering that we have a rather large bridgehead on the left bank of the Oskil River, this entire left bank bridgehead held by our forces. And it becomes clear that since the roads pass through Kupiansk, including those leading to this bridgehead, like the road to Petropavlivka and Pischane, these crossings are under the control and fire of enemy drones. It's not that simple. The logistics there are now very, very complicated for us, but the servicemen in this direction continue to hold back the enemy and relatively isolate them. That's how things stand. Difficult circumstances both in Kupiansk and in the south near Pokrovsk. How long it will be possible to hold out, or whether something might change, it's hard for me to say. Of course, I won't make such predictions, but I will continue to monitor the situation. And of course, I will keep you informed about the current state of affairs. And I ask you to support this work with your likes, comments, and subscriptions. Stay healthy.